Thank you for coming this hour. I was told that this is breakfast time for Kochi, so we have a quiet start of the morning here. But I hope this is going to be 2 very exciting days. First, I want to thank our hosts and collaborators. Firstly, is the visionary founders of the Kochi Muziri Biennale. This is really one of the most exciting new biennales happening in Asia. So I want to thank Jose Reyes and Shvetal, who have really made this one of the most exciting things around this region. And then Jitish Kala, who's done this magical show. We were all given a tour yesterday. And also to welcome to all our friends from the Inter-Asia School who have made the journey to come over here. I was going to give a little brief talk about what the Inter-Asia Biennale Forum is, but since we're all pretty much fellows here, I'm just going to be very brief. The idea of this is really to take part in an intellectual program, which is becoming intellectual programs being very much part of biennales around the world today. And the Inter-Asia School feels that this is a great opportunity to insert a public program that would bring the region together. So far, the Inter-Asia Biennale forums have created forums in the Taipei Biennale in September last year, and then Shanghai Biennale, and this is the 3rd one. The Inter-Asia School and the Inter-Asia Biennale Forum is essentially a congregation of friends, friends who have their own practices around the region. And oh, sorry. Thank you, Teju. So this is really an effort which is very much parallel to what Biennale does. It is a mapping of like minds across the region. I would say we intend to be a traffic of ideas, and I hope this traffic would converge with the effort of the Biennale here. The founding of the Inter-Asia School, also a very brief note. We started in 2012 at the Shanghai Biennale with Chen Guangxing, who is present today, and also other fellows from the original Inter-Asia project, and also the West Heavens project and friends who have taken part. To kick off this program today, also how this started off. We started having a conversation about doing this forum at the beginning of last year with Jitish in Hong Kong, and then again followed up with a Shvetal in May in Basel. So I'm very pleased this has happened. But this really congealed only a few months ago with Tejaswini and Hamad Nasa and me in Hong Kong. And the idea of this particular forum, the theme, comes from, in fact, the idea that is going to be Teju's first paper today, which is how music, the love of music, creates a public in Bombay. And today we have 3 talks, and we will start with Tejaswini's lecture, which will be responded by Wang Sun-Quan. Wang Sun-Quan is from Taiwan. He's a social activist. He has done many projects with performance groups in the city. He is also an academic. The second talk we have today is with Ashish is going to talk about cinema, and he has actually created a program of cinema for China, and he's now presenting a film program starting from here, which will be really a return visit of Chinese documentary film to India. And he'll be this discussion with Ashish will be Wang Sun-Quan again, and then Mr. Ikegami from Tokyo. And so welcome to friends who are coming here for the first time. Then Jitish Kala is going to speak about this exhibition project and how a public forum, not just in Kochi, but really around the art world through this project. And Professor Lu Xinghua from Hangzhou, he's who is a philosopher and teaches at the Tongji University and the Chinese Academy of Art, and he's also here for the first time. And tonight there'll be a film program. Before I forget to thank everybody, but this forum, several people have worked very closely with everybody, and they are Chen Yun from the West Heavens office, and Bandu from the Biennale office, and also Sabi from the Asian Archive in India. So without further ado, we should start the first talk. Welcome. I've been negligent. The discussion with Tejaswini Niranjana's talk is Sumangala, who you all know very well. She made this incredible closing performance for the last Biennale, which congealed this idea of this festive Biennale of India. And she has very kindly come specially for one day to be discussing with Professor Niranjana, and also Ding Nai Fei, also a professor from Taiwan.
So no formalities, mostly friends here. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Johnson and Chenyun and Sabi and Bandhu and all my discussants and all the friends who are here today. This is a work that I've been engaged in over the last 3 years or so. My previous work has also been on music, but on popular music, which will connect to questions that Sumangala has been asking in her work. Hindustani music, I think most of you here would be familiar with what that signifies in India today, but it wasn't always called that. This name acquired this particular shape sometime in the 20th century. It has often been called Indian music in the last 150 years. It has been called by the specific genres that it was engaging in. Earlier it would have been Dhrupad, then subsequently by the 19th century it would be Khayal. There are many lighter forms, lighter genres, which are also called Indian music, the Qawwali, the Ori, the Ghazal, Dadra, etc. And today it's called art music, raga music, North Indian music, Hindustani classical music, whatever. So I'll just call it Hindustani music for the purposes of this presentation. So in this work, maybe I should begin by simply showing you a postcard from one of the sources of my work. It's really interesting frame, if you like, and has very interesting figures in it. On the left side, you have a tawaif. For those friends from across Asia who may not know who that person is, the tawaif would be a courtesan, someone who is learned in the Urdu and Persian classics, who is a singer, a dancer, an entertainer, who is part of usually the courtly structure in the Mughal courts. And there were many such in under the Mughals before the 18th century. And 1857, which is the time of the first war of Indian independence, marks a sort of watershed in the way that music evolves. Music and of course other performative arts as well, but music in particular for the purposes of my story, that the tawaifs, who are the entertainers, the singers, their accompanists who play a variety of different instruments, the singers who are very often male, who are the hereditary singers from particular families that continue the singing styles. Can I turn this fan a little? I'm dying in the kitchen. No, I want it on. So what happens in 1857 is that already over the last 100 years, 100 years before that, the Mughal court has basically disintegrated, and many people who owed their livelihood, who had patrons in the Mughal court, began to disperse, to the smaller principalities. A lot of them came to Awadh, as is otherwise known, which is where Lucknow is. And in 1857, when that particular court was finally dismantled by British colonialism, the people who are from that court then began to disperse widely across India. They went to Western India, many of them came further south, many of them were in the Bombay Presidency, and they began to look for new patrons across the Indian princely states. The rise of Bombay as a major commercial center by the 1830s and 40s allows that city, which earlier was simply a bunch of little islands, across mangrove swamps, when in the 1830s Bombay begins to really come together as a very major commercial center, the musicians, the accompanists, the entertainers start gravitating towards Bombay. And it's a very long and complicated story that I'm simplifying for the purposes of this presentation and due to shortage of time. If you have questions, I'm happy to get into the detailing of it. So what happens when you have a large number of entertainers coming to a commercial capital looking for new forms of patronage is you have the rise of the ticketed performance for the very first time in the 19th century. You have these people also coming into, much later, by the time of the early 20th century, the recording companies from Europe and America, and also then subsequently smaller companies in India begin to record these singers and circulate the records. So the gramophone player and the gramophone record become a very important device by which knowledge of and interest in Hindustani music spreads across India. Another side comment here is another interesting technological development that fuels the rise of Hindustani music is the railway. Because now the major singers and companies are able to travel on the small narrow gauge train across the length and breadth of India, and they take breaks on their journeys where they train students every time they stop. Again, this becomes a way by which Hindustani music spreads across the length and breadth of the country. So with the spread of the music, you have the rise of new publics. Today I'll only be speaking about a new kind of urban public that takes shape in Bombay. So the publics are for Hindustani music and also through Hindustani music is part of my argument that the public takes shape. The way I'm using this term public, I'm just coming back to the other figure on the right when I finish this particular part of the argument, that we're looking at the rendering public through performance, through pedagogy, of a music that earlier would have been in sacred spaces or in smaller or more elite courtly audiences. I'm also interested in this project, which is done jointly with a filmmaker and with a few architects as well, in different types of publicly accessible built space, and the ways in which it comes to be filled with song through dramatic and musical performances. I'm also interested in the creation of new distinctions between public and private, inside and outside, home and street. This is a function both of how we organize space and how we organize performance. And these emerge in connection with the music, which is what I'm arguing about here. So in the larger project of this, of which this paper is part, which is called Making Music, Making Space, we're trying to assemble a musical cartography of Mumbai that has to be read on the historical plane and on the geographical plane as well. I hope to get a chance to show you the ways in which we are looking at the geography. But very quickly, the kind of musicians coming to Mumbai are coming through different and complex forms of migration, as I've already mentioned. The figure on the right, the Naikin, is another figure that comes into Bombay in the late 19th century. This is someone who's formerly a Devadasi or someone dedicated to the god and a woman performer in Goa, which is further to the west of west and south of Bombay. And already by the mid-19th century, the Devadasis had moved away from the temple courtyards where earlier they were to be found and joined small touring companies or repertory companies where they used to be part of the musical plays. And in very large numbers, after about the 1860s or 70s, they started coming into Bombay city, looking to become Hindustani or more classical kinds of singers, looking for to learn from the great teachers who were coming from the north, predominantly Muslim, the Muslim ustads, And they found patrons, in the Bhatia community, or the Bhatiyas are a subcaste of the Hindus, sort of Gujarati merchant community, and they were the ones who paid for the lessons with the ustads, cohabited with the women, often bore children with them. They were like a second wife, or to invoke a figure from Ding Naife's work, the concubine figure, right? But someone who was a performer in her own right. We are really not clear about the numbers of Goan women who came into Bombay and learned Hindustani music. We have just a few scattered figures. One very interesting figure is that just three brothers, the three brothers who founded the Bhendi Bazaar Gharana, which is an indigenous Bombay Gharana. Gharana is a school of music, a style of music. The Khan brothers is Nathan Khan, Chaju Khan, and Khadim Hussain Khan. When they came into Bombay, and by 1890 they start, after 20 years of being in Bombay, they start a distinctive kind of music, the Bhendi Bazaar Gharana. Just the three of them are supposed to have trained up to 60 Goan women. And you can imagine that they all performed for a living. They were able to make a living based on their singing. And there were clearly many larger numbers of women who learned from other musicians as well. I hope I will have a chance to tell you what happened to them and what happened to them like 100 years later. But right now we're still in the 19th century, in about the mid-19th century. Here's a figure, again from another postcard of that time, of a tawaif performing. You can see the accompanist. You can see that they're playing while she dances and sings. Here's a singing group. These are not very good resolution images. For the exhibition that we are hoping to do in June, we are going to have much better images. It's just a selection of things that we've been picking up from this particular source. Yeah. So my aim in this project has been not to provide a history or a comprehensive history of Hindustani music in Bombay, but instead to argue that what we need to do when we have this accumulation of historical detail is to think through the significance of this cultural practice in the colonial city and in the post-colonial city. So I've been focusing on key aspects of musical teaching, musical training, of pedagogy, and of musical performance. I've looked at the trajectories of specific musicians. We have done a number of interviews of contemporary singers, organizers, collectors, and students. We have nearly 30 of those. They're up on the platform Padma, pad.ma. I will give you the link afterwards. Do take a look at that. These are going to be extensively annotated interviews that give you a sense of the story of this music in the last 60 or 70 years. So I'm really focusing here in this presentation on the connection between music and urban space, and the self-fashioning of Bombay's inhabitants. So I'm trying to understand how Hindustani music maps onto and helps reconfigure public space in Bombay. The journeys of performers, of audiences, and of students take them into different kinds of spaces, in different neighborhoods. And over a century and a half, these spaces resonate with the music over which people obsessed. Just to give you a flavor of the music, oops, where is it? Sorry, this doesn't seem to be working. Can I just do something else? Do they have the audio up? Kesar by Kerkar, one of the last of the famous Naikin or Kalawan singers who had migrated from Goa. There won't be time to play much of this, I'm afraid, so I just move on my presentation. Okay, that's fine, you can stay in the background. So one of I'm interested in the stories of these singers, of course, and the Tawaips and the Naikins and so on. But also a very special interest to me is the lay person who became obsessed with this music and even decided to learn how to sing this music. So in many ways, these sort of lay people aspired to the status of a performer. They did not come from hereditary musical families. They wanted to become a singer or an instrumentalist under the public gaze. So this non-hereditary musician, I'm going to argue, was aspiring to perform a specific kind of modernity. And this modernity was called into being elusively and fleetingly through the performance itself. I hope this becomes clear as I go along. But I think that some scholars have sort of rather prematurely called this a proto-nationalist modernity. And it says, so this kind of argument says that tradition gets reconfigured as a prerequisite of this modernity. This is by now fairly well-known set of arguments. But in a sense, to subsume this under the story of nationalist reconfiguration of Indian traditions is to slightly miss the point. Because I think that you don't get an idea of what is happening, for example, in this situation. So while the proliferation of music schools and the drawing in of substantial numbers of middle and lower middle class people into the practice of classical music was happening in many parts of India, the scale and intensity of this engagement in Bombay was quite exceptional. So we need an explanation for this phenomenon that doesn't simply subsume it under the story of Indian nationalism. What is the centrality of Bombay city in this engagement with North Indian music? And I hope to just throw out a couple of ideas about this. The argument I want to make is about Bombay and language. The public space of Bombay owes its distinct character to the specific historical conditions that mark the city's emergence and growth. There was no dominant community in the city, historically speaking, and no dominant language. Since it was populated by speakers of Marathi, of Gujarati, of Konkani, of Hindustani Urdu, of Telugu and other South Indian languages, Christians who spoke English and other languages, Baghdadi Jews who spoke a dialect of Arabic. Here's a nice quotation from a colonial traveler who was struck by the linguistic diversity of Bombay in 1832, and I quote here, "In 20 minutes walk through the bazaar of Bombay, my ear has been struck with the sounds of every language that I've heard in any other part of the world, uttered not in corners and by chance, as it were, but in a tone and a manner which implied that the speakers felt quite at home." So this linguistic diversity is a crucial indicator of other kinds of diversity. This is a question I'll come back to in a minute. So Bombay's position as the second most important city in the British Empire next to London is due to its unique history of indigenous trade, of seafaring, of commerce that existed well before the establishment of British forms of governance in the city. I think that some of my friends from Hong Kong and China would know that a large part of Bombay's wealth was because of the opium trade. I think it was mentioned elsewhere yesterday as well. So in a sense, rather than being merely a colonial city, it's actually an imperial city, if you like, given a specific form of urban development. This is a process, this urban development of Bombay is a process to which Indians contributed in large numbers, both financially and otherwise. So not simply that it was a colonial city where the formation of what was urban came from the British. So it would be a mistake then to see the kinds of things that Indian philanthropists contributed to building, even though there were railways, bridges, causeways, concert halls, schools, colleges, hospitals, statues, whatever, right? These were not dictated solely by British tastes and ambitions. Rather, Indian aspirations about how to configure public space shaped their decisions about what to support financially and politically. And their aesthetic choices whether manifested in architecture or cultural practices like Hindustani music, drew on their complex and socially diverse repertoire, which became available in Bombay city through the in-migrations of the 19th century. The census of 1891, which showed Bombay's population to be a little over 8.8 million, showed that only a quarter of these inhabitants were born inside the city of Bombay. So the population is overwhelmingly composed of migrants, and this has been true for a very long time in Bombay. Even 30 years later, in 1921, only 16% of the people who live in Bombay are born inside Bombay. Everyone else was born outside. Starting from the 1860s and well into the 20th century, Bombay comes to occupy, as I've indicated earlier, a central position in assembling the new structures and spaces of performance, of pedagogy, of recording and consumption of Hindustani music. Opera House, which is a very major structure, has its own sort of colonial references, was a proscenium theatre, which became quite common in the 19th century. One of those that played host to different kinds of performances, to theatre in many languages, to Hindustani music concerts as well. Later became a cinema house, then was not functional for a long time and is now renovated again. So the proscenium theatre like this and many others which showcase the Parsi plays, the Marathi Sangeet Natak, and then there was the music club or the music circle, smaller groups of people. The Baitak, which is like a small home concert in a wealthy patron's home. The music school, where they often had concerts and performances. The music conference, as it was called, where all the musicians came together annually or biannually. The concert stage in places like Lakshmi Bagh, Brahman Sabha, and this is a quick mention, at right angles to Opera House is a road which earlier used to have the shops of the recording companies. Then they became shops that sold musical instruments. This is one of the oldest shops that still exists. So in a sense, and even in the religious festivals like the Ganesh Utsav, which has its own history connected to Indian nationalism, from the late 19th century you had the what used to be a somewhat private religious function in people's homes using the god Ganesh became a very, very public festival. And everyone across religion was invited to sing in these big festivals. So this goes to show, and this is part of my argument, that musicophilia became an important facet of the metropolitan scene. So in a sense, Hindustani art music in its many forms, including the forms made popular in the Natya Sangeet or the musical plays, that Hindustani music provides the affective basis for the shared modernity taking shape in Bombay in the late 19th and early mid-20th centuries. So this affect is created through listening together and listening to each other, and through the culture of appreciation, or the wah wah mandali, that you say wah when you listen to something that you really like, that develops in the city. And this affect is created is manifested in the linguistic zone that develops around Hindustani music, where people speaking many different Indian languages and coming from different social and religious backgrounds converge in singing and listening to, and also then learning a form of northern Indian music that presented its compositions primarily in dialects related to the Hindustani language, which is is a composition of many dialects of the North Indian language. So I'll argue further that an understanding of the musicophiliac modernity of Bombay is relevant to any account of the emergence of a public domain in a colonial society, and to the transformation of that domain in the 20th and 21st centuries. I further want to propose that the nature of that public domain was deeply colored by what are called the performance of modernity evidenced in Hindustani music. It's a particular kind of performance. I hope at the end I will be able to affirm to you what kind of affective modernity that will be. And this kind of articulation of modernity, made possible through Hindustani music in Bombay, may help us understand how and through what modalities and in what directions other domains of cultural and social experience were also being transformed. A dominant argument of current critical thinkers who are writing about Hindustani music, and I have in mind someone like Janaki Bakle, would be that a figure like Vishnu Digambar Paluskar, who was a major musician and pedagogue of the early 20th century, that he represents a certain sort of reclassicizing and Hinduizing of this music, an attempt to sanitize it and remove the Islamic elements from it and remove also the vulgar or erotic elements from it. I find this in many ways a rather simplistic like analysis of what actually happened, because in our project we have actually taken a different route. We look at performance, we look at practice, we look at pedagogy, rather than the public utterances or writings of music ideologues like Bharkande and Panuskar. And I think that if you look at the content of Hindustani music, even the compositions sung by so-called Hindu ideologues, we see a good deal of explicitly Islamic content. In my own, somewhat limited experience of learning music, I recall several compositions or bandishes of the Gwalior Gayaki which seem completely Islamic and have been sung and passed down by generations of Hindu singers. It's a very well-known fact that Muslim ustads routinely sing compositions about Hindu gods. They also sang in the Hindu temples. And there's a strong collective memory of such singers among those who follow Hindustani music. If you look at the friendships and mentorships in Hindustani music involving Hindus and Muslims, Panuskar's own student, B.R. Devadhar, his most intimate interlocutors were two Muslim singers. Sinde Khan, sort of a fakir who traveled all over and was not tied down to any particular place, who became his revered teacher. Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, a major singer of the 20th century, again a teacher, mentor and friend of Devadhar. And the relationship with these musicians in Devadhar's case lasted over 30 years. The prominent tabla player and music composer Nikhil Ghosh had another famous Muslim ustad, Ahmed Jan Tirakwa, who played the tabla, living in his house for nearly 10 years, during the late 50s and early 60s. Sitar player Arvind Parekh, a Hindu, Ustad Vilayat Khan, Muslim, apart from being student and teacher, had a deep friendship over half a century, until the latter's death in 2004. These are just a few examples. There are dozens that we can talk about. And all this complicates the picture enormously. And the story of the assembling of a national music that is simultaneously Hindu is not unidirectional, it's not a finished process as the others make it out to be. So, as far as my argument is concerned, what these intimate relationships across religion and social class caste might signify is how musicophiliacs in Bombay tried to create the conditions that would allow them to shape their lives in performance. Through new systems of patronage and cross-class relationships with musicians, they sought to draw this so-called traditional music into modern public space, ensuring that it became a crucial part of urban experience. I've already talked about the Naikins who were learning Hindustani music in Bombay. The Tawaifs actually was a slightly different story. I'll come to them again in a minute. But the most immediate student constituency in the late 19th century consisted of upper caste men. There were Hindus and Parsis from the new professional class, lawyers, accountants, doctors, journalists. There were some upper caste Hindus from impoverished backgrounds with a familial connection to, say, devotional music sung in the temples. Women from the Devdasi, Naikin caste. So these were all the new students of Hindustani music. One of my favorite stories is about the Naikin figure, the Goan woman, Babli Bai Patkar, who was 6 feet tall, who ate 4 chickens a day, who had a very robust and wonderful voice, and who was able to make all the great Muslim singers go running when she began to sing, because she was such a powerful performer. There's not very much known about her. It's just mentioned here and there that she studied with Natan Khan Agrawale of the Bendi Bazar Gharana, and of course there were very famous, the most famous of them all, of the Goan singers were Mogu Bai Kurdikar and Kesar Bai Kerkar. Both of them had patrons who were bhatiyas, who paid for their lessons, who really helped them to create the conditions under which they could learn from the great Aladia Khan, the Muslim Ustad. There are many stories about actors from the Marathi theatre who would accept invitations to perform with their companies in Bombay so as to get a chance to learn with the great singers and become their own disciples. So this other distinctive singer I've already shown you her picture is the Tawaif, who was part of the same 1857 migration that brought the singers and others to Bombay. The Tawaifs set up kotas or establishments in Bombay in and around the Grant Road, Lavington Road area, which is around the same area that this place is in. In this establishment, they would sing, they would have musical evenings, they would play host to visiting male musicians. So two of the most famous Muslim singers who stayed in a kota, this, I'll show you where this place is. This is the area, very close to Opera House, where a number of the Tawaifs and Naikins both, who migrated to Bombay, were staying. This is the kota where Bade Ghulam Ali Khan and Amir Khan stayed, with a Tawaif called Gangabai. It's called the NB compound. It still exists. It's today a Mujra hall, where various forms of dance performance take place. The courtesans are not sex workers. They are very clear that they maintain the distinction between what they do and what so-called sex workers do in other parts of Bombay in a very similar neighborhood. It's been remarked by musicians themselves that not enough credit is given to the Tawaifs for carrying forward through their own talim, through their own training and their support for practitioners, the musical lineages that found such welcome in Bombay. Tawaifs were not often acknowledged by ustads as their real pupils. They were taught by beankars and sarangi players who played the various instruments, who had assimilated the music of the great singers while accompanying them during their performance. So in the course of the 20th century, with the rise of the film industry in Bombay, women performers from Tawaif backgrounds found new employment in the Hindi language cinema. Parallelly, Kalavant women singers from Goa and their descendants became important figures in the Marathi Sangeet Natak or musical play. I don't think I have much time, so I will not go into the history of the theatre and its connection to Hindustani music in Bombay. I will just mention one or two important facts. That the history of the musical theatre is tied to the history of Hindustani music in Bombay. It's very, very closely. In fact, it's the popularity of the theatre, which had a lot of light classical genres of Hindustani, that made this kind of music popular, among a large number of people. The earlier Parsi theatre, which was first in Gujarati language and then in Hindustani Urdu very quickly, or in a Marathi language Sangeet Natak, audiences encountered melodies from art music through the lighter forms, which I've already mentioned, the dadra, the hori, the ghazal, the thumri and the qawwali. So while the Parsi theatre or the Sangeet Natak did not usually provide a performance platform for classical music per se, the songs, often more than 60 in each play, were based on the ragas, were based on this form of music, both Hindustani and Carnatic or South Indian to some extent, and cultivated this taste for classical music in the theatre audiences. Many singers who later became famous as classical musicians began their performing careers on the Marathi and Kannada stage, including Savai Gandharva, his student Bhimsen Joshi, Mallikarjun Mansoor and others. Very quickly, a lovely story I know about Savai Gandharva, which has come up from one of our interviews. Savai Gandharva had another major singer, Parsi man called Firoz Dastur. I will try to see if I can play you Firoz Dastur's music in a minute. So the story goes as follows. Firoz Dastur was a young lad learning from Savai Gandharva whenever he came to Bombay. They lived in the area called Girgaon, which is the focus of my investigations. One day during the monsoons, it was raining extremely heavily and they were waiting for the teacher to come to teach Firoz, the young boy Firoz in his house. 2 hours later, Firoz's mother was very anxious. She went up on the terrace of the house, looked out and then saw an umbrella moving towards them. The water was really high, the teacher was going through the water and coming to their house. He finally arrived. He took off his footwear, he shook off the water from his, whatever he rubbed himself, started teaching the young boy. And after a while, the boy wondered where his mother had gone, so he sort of looked around the house, went into the kitchen and found his mother toasting the slippers of the teacher on a tawa or in a saucepan, because she wanted to make sure that he went home warm, because it get wet in a minute again. So this really interesting story, I think, and many anecdotes like that we have collected through the process of the investigation, gives us a sense of the larger picture that we can build in relation to the musicophilia of Bombay's inhabitants. So Dastur came from a family that was not musical. His parents wanted him to learn Hindustani music, and this is the kind of reverence with which they treated the teacher. Yes. What's happening? Yes, you can hear it. Singing Khavaj in 1974. These are all live recordings from our research. Very low. Okay, I'm trying to now pull together the strands of my argument. Confronted by European knowledge in the modern education system that was formalized after 1835, Indians responded in at least two ways, both of which are relevant for the discussion about music in Bombay. Historians and theorists like Bhatkande, for example, pulled together and codified Indian knowledge about music and attempted to represent it along the same parameters as Western knowledge, with an emphasis on rendering the music teachable to larger and larger numbers of people. Others connected strongly to conventions of performance, which you might call mehfil, traditions of practice or riyaz, coming out of a different way of training or talim, based primarily on oral transmission. The schools, the enormous number of music schools that came into being at this time, built their pedagogy on older methods of teaching, even as they developed elaborate notation systems. So earlier it was an oral tradition, and at this time they started notating it. So it is not unknown for a music school trained singer to shift away and then start working with, a guru or ustad for individualized talim. I won't go into the details of it. Just to say that in 1870, the Parsi Gayan Uttejak Mandali was started, which had a number of members. They offered training in music. In fact, Bhatkande, the music theorist, was one of the earliest students of this Parsi Gayan Uttejak Mandali. That lasted for nearly 100 years. There are many, many other schools that came up. I will not go into the details. I'm happy to offer them to you if you're interested. But even to this day, if you jump like 100 years or so, even to this day, there are about 10,000 people studying Hindustani music in Bombay city. This is across generations. This is I'll tell you how we arrived at an estimate, but later. I have a long section on the reform of Hindustani music. I'm not again going into that. All I wanted to mention here was that looking at the number of music schools that came up in the 19th century and in the 20th century, clearly the schools are catering to a constituency that is not from a hereditary musical background, but are trying to come to the school to learn this kind of music, right? So there are many discussions of music pedagogy in our research interviews as well. And the only point I want to make here is how the pedagogic impulse connects to the musicophilia of Bombay's inhabitants. So now conclude by coming back to the question of language and social diversity. As Catherine Hansen has pointed out in her very insightful work on Parsi theatre, Urdu or Hindustani was not the first language of many Bombay residents. I've already mentioned the census to you. There are many other census figures we have. That it's only about 12 to 13% of the population at any time in Bombay city that actually has Hindustani or Urdu for its native language. How is it then that those of you who are familiar with Bombay city think of Hindustani as really the lingua franca of Bombay? How is it that Hindustani has become the cultural vernacular, if you like, of Bombay, to the extent that the major cultural industry in Bombay, which is the Hindi cinema today, sometimes called Bollywood, is in that particular language, right? I am arguing that it has to do with the linguistic diversity of Bombay and has to do with how music underlies that particular connection that people make across that diversity. So very quickly as to, again without going into the details, why I'm making that argument. So while Catherine Hansen says that the circulation of linguistic forms through popular media articulates social boundaries, and enables the configuration of linguistic identities. I feel that while this is a brilliant insight, it needs to be really pushed beyond the domain that she's talking about. She's talking about the cinema or the theatre, but if I'm to bring that into the story of Hindustani art music and the public domain, I want to modify that insight to some extent. So instead of saying that the circulation of such forms enables linguistic identities to be configured, I want to argue that it's precisely the circulation and normativization of the language of Hindustani musical compositions that allow linguistic preferences in Bombay to be layered, so that a person engaging with art music in Bombay, whether in the 19th century or the present, moves constantly between languages in daily interaction, but privileges Hindustani, which includes all its dialects, and in the compositions that they sing. So one reason why some form of Hindustani becomes the main mode of communication in Bombay and remains so to this day is precisely because it is underlaid with the lingua musica, which has become part of the cultural vernacular of the city by the early 20th century. So I think I'll conclude my presentation here so as to have time for discussion. I will not go into what has happened to the Tawaifs and the Naikins. I'll wait for questions to try and address that. So the social background of the performers has actually changed substantially today, but the musical styles and pedagogic practices still draw on and bear the impress of the musical archive assembled over 100 years ago, when Hindustani music started becoming such a prominent presence in the public space of Bombay city. I'll end with an anecdote from Rabindranath Tagore, the Bengali poet, artist, nationalist, who complained about Hindustani music. What was his complaint? He said, I want to sing about my own individual sorrow, but the moment I break into Hindustani music, I find myself singing about universal sorrow. Where is the place for my personal joys and sorrows in Hindustani music? So he says, I want to write my own poetry. I want to compose my own music and sing my own music. So this idea of the romantic individual striving for self-expression and freedom from social bonds is a recurring trope in modern Indian literature as it came into being in the late 19th century. This was a trope central to the English education that produced the new middle classes, and the features of the modern person to be brought into being by that modern education included rationality, autonomy, freedom of choice. But I want to say that that's not the whole story. Through their musicophilia, the inhabitants of Bombay, where the visual and infrastructural aspects of India's public modernity were so strongly foregrounded, that these inhabitants of Bombay, through their musicophilia, seemed to strain against the logic of capital. Instead of singing about personal joys and sorrows, the musicophiliacs vocalized Hindustani music, where the melodic structures hint at the rigorous discipline of voice and body that enable expression. The private as well as public utterances of this community of musicophiliacs might have invoked the need to compile and codify Indian music to resemble modern forms of knowledge, and thus contribute to a national tradition. But the lived experience of music could not be explained away by ethnic origin, caste or jati identity, national citizenship or linguistic background. The history of Bombay gives us a clue as to how the lingua musica took shape, how it defined the public domain in the city, as well as the direction of future cultural practice, and how it informed the experience of urbanity in these urbs prima in Indus. So I'll stop the story of Bombay here, but end with one small anecdote, which again from the research, which shows you how the musicophilia, again took shape in Bombay. Bhaskar Bua Bakle, a famous musician of the early 20th century, who later went on to compose for the stage, learned from three famous ustads of three different gharanas. His middle teacher was Latan Khan from the Agra Gharana. Latan Khan used to come to Bhaskar Bua's house in Girgaon, which is the area we are studying, and teach him, sing there, hang out in his house. He always wanted alcohol to accompany the musical sessions, and Bhaskar Bua, who himself did not drink, or the Maharashtrian Brahmin, brought the alcohol for his guru. Bhaskar Bua's landlord, who was another Brahmin, got very suspicious about this Muslim man coming to the house and wondered what was going on in his sessions. So when he comes in, Nathan Khan knew that the bottles were lying around, there was a glass of, there was a soda bottle and alcohol and so on. So as soon as the landlord came in sniffing and wondering what was going on, Nathan Khan, the Muslim musician, broke into song and he sang a devotional Hindu bhajan. And the landlord went away very impressed and said he can come anytime he likes. So that's the end of the story.